Today's episode features a deeply unsettling and creepy camping story. But before we dive into that, if you're a fan of scary stories, make sure to give us a like and subscribe. All right, let's get into it. On the afternoon of May 6th, 2008, a 54-year-old man named Ricky Williams stood on the bank of Dismal Creek in Western Virginia, casting his line into the water. Ricky was hoping to catch some trout, but after 30 minutes of fishing, he hadn't had a single bite. Normally, Ricky wouldn't mind. He loved fishing for hours, but today was different. He and his dog, who was with him, were really hungry. They'd been camping in these woods for several weeks, and their food supply was almost gone. If Ricky didn't catch any fish today, they might not eat. Despite its bleak name, Dismal Creek is a beautiful, secluded spot on top of a mountain along the Appalachian Trail, a famous 2,200-mile trail that runs along the east coast of the United States. Hikers on the trail follow a special code. If you come across another hiker in need, you help them, and they help you if you're in need. Ricky knew this code well and was secretly hoping that as he cast his line over and over with no success, a hiker might come by and offer some food. But another half hour passed, and still no hikers came by, and Ricky couldn't catch any fish. Then suddenly, Ricky's dog started whining and shifting around as if sensing a predator. As Ricky tried to calm his dog, he heard a voice coming from the woods behind him. Someone was approaching. On one hand, Ricky was hopeful it could be a hiker who might share some food, but on the other hand, he felt uneasy. Ricky was an older, frail man who had grown even weaker over the past few weeks of camping with little food. He wasn't a threat to anyone. Although the Appalachian Trail is generally safe, there had been several murders there over the years. One of these killings occurred less than 2 miles from where Ricky was fishing. A well-known killer, Randall Lee Smith, had stabbed and shot 2 hikers to death. Knowing this made Ricky even more apprehensive as he listened to the voice getting closer. Finally, a man in his early 30s emerged from the trees. He looked at Ricky for a moment before grinning and saying, "Hey, how you doing?" Immediately, Ricky felt relieved. This guy didn't seem like a threat. The man introduced himself as Scott Johnston and explained that he was camping in the area with a friend, and they were out fishing just like Ricky. Ricky quickly asked if Scott had any food, and Scott generously gave him some energy bars, chips, and fresh bait. For the next couple of hours, the 2 men fished together, and eventually the trout started biting. Ricky's day had turned around. As the sun was setting and they finished fishing, Scott invited Ricky to join him and his friend at their campsite for dinner. With no food of his own, Ricky gratefully accepted. As they walked toward the campsite, Scott's fishing pole got tangled in a low-hanging branch. He struggled with it for a while before telling Ricky to go on ahead, assuring him that the campsite was just up the hill. Ricky hesitated, but then continued up the hill. When he reached the clearing, he immediately noticed a massive man, much larger than Scott, hunched over the campfire. He heard Ricky step into the campsite, and remember, it was nighttime, and they were in the middle of nowhere. The man turned his head and saw a stranger standing there with Scott nowhere in sight. Grabbing a thick piece of wood like a club, he looked at Ricky with a menacing glare, as if to say, "What are you doing here?" Ricky, caught off guard by how big this guy was, quickly raised his hands and said, "I'm so sorry. Scott sent me up here. I don't know if this is the right spot. I'm sorry." Just then, Scott emerged from the tree line, having untangled his fishing line, and patted Ricky on the back. "Oh, you've already met my friend, Sean," Scott said. As soon as he said that, Sean relaxed, putting down the piece of wood and stopping his intense stare. But even though Sean seemed to let his guard down, Ricky couldn't shake the feeling that Sean wasn't happy to see him, despite the fact that Scott had invited him there. Feeling uncomfortable, Ricky noticed that Scott was ushering him closer to the campfire, encouraging him to sit next to Sean. "Sean's a great cook. He'll make a feast out of our catch. Come on, take a seat." Ricky was annoyed that Scott was pressuring him to stay, but he didn't want to be rude by leaving abruptly. So he reluctantly sat down next to Sean, who clearly wasn't thrilled about having company. As Ricky sat there uneasily, Scott handed Sean the fish they had caught so he could start preparing them. Ricky just sat there unsure of what to do. After a moment, he asked, "Hey, "Can you give me a knife? I can help clean the fish." But Sean and Scott waved him off, telling him not to worry. They had it under control. So Ricky remained seated, nervously watching as the light from the fire flickered off their knives. Finally, Scott and Sean finished deboning the fish and started cooking them over the open flame. The mood seemed to lighten a bit as the two men put away their knives, and Ricky began to feel slightly more at ease. He tried to make small talk to calm his nerves, telling them how much he loved the Appalachian Trail and how he often came out here with his dog for weeks at a time. He talked about how being in nature felt like a religious experience for him, and he even shared that he sometimes meditated, prayed, and chanted as part of his ritual to connect with Mother Nature. As Ricky opened up about his life, he noticed the two men were listening and nodding at the right moments, but he also felt like they were silently judging him, thinking he was a bit odd. Their subtle reactions made Ricky suddenly feel embarrassed for sharing so much, realizing they might not actually want him there. Just then, the fish was ready, and they all sat in silence, quickly eating the meal. By the time they finished, it was around 8 p.m., and the night had fully settled in. Ricky was more than ready to leave. He thanked Sean and Scott for their hospitality, then quickly got up, grabbed his dog, and started walking back toward his campsite. But after taking only 10 or 15 steps into the woods, two things happened in quick succession. First, Ricky suddenly stopped and turned around to look back at the campsite. Second, as he did, an enormous bang echoed through the forest, like a small explosion. About 30 minutes later, and roughly 4 miles away from where Ricky, Sean, and Scott had been, two women were sitting down to dinner in their remote home when they heard frantic knocking at their front door. Living in such an isolated area, the women were immediately on edge. One of them rushed to the phone, ready to call the police, while the other cautiously approached the front of the house. Peering out the window, she couldn't see anything. It was too dark outside. As the knocking continued, she unlocked the door and cracked it open. What she saw nearly made her faint. Standing on the porch was a man, drenched in blood, as if he had been completely submerged in it. His entire body was stained red, and he had his hand pressed against his neck, where blood was rhythmically pulsing out in time with his heartbeat. The man was clearly bleeding to death. The woman screamed for her companion to call 911, shouting that someone was dying on their doorstep. As the other woman dialed, the man on the porch pleaded, "Please help me," and muttered something about Dismal Creek before collapsing. The shock of the scene left the woman who had opened the door frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Then she noticed something she hadn't before, a Jeep idling on the road in front of their house. She hadn't registered it until now. It wasn't clear whether the man had been dropped off or if he had driven the Jeep himself. But before she could make sense of what was happening, an ambulance and several police cars came racing up to the house. The medics rushed out, grabbed the bleeding man, and quickly loaded him into the ambulance to take him to the hospital. Meanwhile, not far from the house, police officers were speeding toward Dismal Creek. When the women had called 911, they mentioned that the man on their porch had said something about the location, though they didn't know what it meant. The police, not wanting to waste time, decided to head to Dismal Creek to investigate. As the officers made their way up the winding mountain road, they suddenly saw a truck speeding toward them. The truck initially hit the brakes and seemed to try to swerve out of the way. But then, just as it had nearly come to a stop, the driver suddenly floored the gas pedal again, veering wildly off the road and crashing into an embankment. The truck flipped several times before coming to a halt. The police, who had swerved to avoid being hit, watched the crash in disbelief. It seemed almost intentional, as if the driver had meant to cause the wreck. The officers approached the wrecked truck with their guns drawn, finding a single occupant, the driver, who was somehow still alive. They pulled him from the vehicle and called for an ambulance, sending an officer along to escort him to the hospital. The police were suspicious. After all, they were on their way to Dismal Creek to investigate a man covered in blood, and now they had a truck driver speeding away from that very area and crashing. There was no clear connection yet, but it seemed too coincidental to ignore. About 30 minutes after the truck crash, the police left the scene and continued up the road to Dismal Creek. Once they arrived, they spread out, searching the area for any clues that might explain what had happened. It didn't take long for them to find something unusual. In the middle of the Dismal Creek area, the police discovered a campsite. It wasn't the one where Sean and Scott had been with Ricky earlier. This was a different site, and after inspecting it, the officers quickly concluded that whoever had been staying there seemed mentally unstable and potentially dangerous. The campsite was simple, a tent and a campfire, but what they found inside the tent was disturbing. There was a collection of 30 knives, a police scanner tuned to local radio chatter, and piles of clothing for all ages and genders. There were also 8 pairs of women's underwear, several pairs of eyeglasses, and a map of the Appalachian Trail. The map was marked with numerous circles along the trail, though there was no indication of what the circles meant. However, one of the circled locations was Dismal Creek. Next to the map was a radio with a cassette inside. When the police pressed play, they were creeped out by what they heard. A man's voice, chanting and howling in a way that sounded like some kind of satanic ritual. But the most shocking find inside the tent was a single piece of paper, a birth certificate. The name on it was one that every officer in the area recognized, and anyone living near the Appalachian Trail would know it too. The name on the birth certificate was the key to unraveling all the seemingly disconnected events that had transpired that night. From the explosion after Ricky walked away from the fire, to the bloody man at the house, to the truck crash. They were all connected through this single person. A few hours earlier, after Ricky had walked away from Sean and Scott's campsite and barely made it onto the trail, he turned around just in time to hear a loud explosion. As he looked back at the campsite, he saw Sean and Scott staring at each other in shock and terror. Sean reached up and touched his face, only to see his hand come away covered in blood. He had just been shot in the face. The loud explosion was the sound of Ricky firing a gun at him. As Sean and Scott stood there in disbelief, Ricky, still hidden in the trees, ran toward the fire and continued shooting. Sean, despite his injuries, tried to stand up but staggered and fell. Scott, uninjured at this point, bolted from the campsite. Ricky turned his attention to Scott, shooting him in the neck and back, but somehow Scott kept running, disappearing into the woods. Ricky then turned back to Sean, who was lying on the ground, unable to move. Ricky casually raised his gun and shot Sean in the chest. Amazingly, the second shot triggered an extreme adrenaline rush in Sean. He jumped to his feet, sprinted to his Jeep, and sped away, despite his severe injuries. As he rounded a corner, he saw his friend Scott stumble out of the woods and onto the road. Gravely injured, Sean stopped the Jeep long enough for Scott to climb inside, and they sped toward the nearest help, the house where the 2 women lived. It was Scott, drenched in blood, who knocked on the women's door, while Sean, too weak to move, remained in the Jeep on the road. When the ambulance and police arrived, they found Scott on the porch and Sean in the Jeep, both barely clinging to life. They were airlifted to the hospital. As for the man driving the truck that sped away from Dismal Creek and crashed in front of the police, that was Ricky Williams. Except that wasn't his real name. Ricky Williams was an alias. His real name, the one on the birth certificate found at the other campsite, was Randall Lee Smith, the same Randall Lee Smith who had murdered 2 hikers near Dismal Creek in 1981. Smith had been caught, convicted, and paroled 15 years later in 1996 for good behavior. He lived with his mother, wearing an electronic bracelet for a decade. But by 2008, the bracelet was removed, and unable to continue living with his mother, Randall packed up his belongings, grabbed his dog, and moved out onto the Appalachian Trail. On May 6, 2008, when Sean and Scott arrived at Dismal Creek to go fishing, Randall was waiting for them. No one knows why he murdered those 2 hikers in 1981 or why he targeted Sean and Scott in 2008. All we know is that Randall Lee Smith was mentally unwell and likely viewed the Appalachian Trail as his sacred place, a place he loved more than anything. Perhaps he felt that Sean and Scott had disrespected the trail, though the 2 men did nothing of the sort. Amazingly, Sean and Scott survived the attack. They later recounted how they had felt sorry for Randall, thinking he was just an alcoholic drifter without a home, living in the woods on the Appalachian Trail. They only wanted to give him some food and spent some time with him to make him feel human again. Because Randall appeared to be a small, older man, neither Sean nor Scott, both big and imposing, felt threatened by him. As for the bizarre campsite the police found near Dismal Creek, the one with all the knives and the birth certificate, that was Randall's. The eerie cassette tape they listened to, which sounded like a satanic ritual, was Randall performing his meditations and chants, his way of respecting Mother Nature and the Appalachian Trail. The various clothing, eyeglasses, and women's underwear found inside the tent were suspected to belong to other victims. However, DNA samples from those items did not match any missing persons or murder victims in the police database, rendering them useless as evidence. Police investigated all the locations marked on the map found in Randall's tent, but aside from Dismal Creek, they found no evidence of any violent events. Only Randall knew the truth, but we will never know it, because just 4 days after being pulled from the wrecked truck, he died in police custody from a blood clot caused by the crash. During those 4 days, Randall never admitted to having any other victims. Today, Sean still has a bullet lodged in his head and chest, and Scott bears significant scarring on his neck and back. Despite their injuries, both men have made remarkable recoveries and continue to return to Dismal Creek for camping and fishing.